father's name is Jairus. I remember the day when everything changed. I was about 12 years old. Up until that point, I was a fairly healthy girl, just approaching womanhood. But suddenly, one day, I became sick. At first, I thought it would pass, but instead, I became worse. I could see that my parents were worried. I couldn't even get out of bed. I was very, very sick. Things are a little hazy after that. I remember mother and father's faces. There seemed to be a lot of people around. I think I heard my father talking about a rabbi named Jesus. Father said that maybe if the rabbi came, he could make a miracle and the Lord would heal me. I remember father coming in to say goodbye and then he left the house. Everything felt strange and I felt sleepy. I don't know what happened after that. The next thing I remember was a voice. A gentle, kind voice, a commanding voice, the most wonderful voice I've ever heard. He spoke to me in my own language, Talitha cum, little girl, I say to you, get up. As soon as I heard him, I wanted to obey, so I opened my eyes, and there was Jesus. He was wonderful. I got up out of bed and began to walk around the room with him. My mother and father were there. They were so happy to see me. At first, I couldn't understand why they were crying, or why the mourners were outside. Then they told me I had been dead until Jesus came. But then Jesus called to me, and I have never felt so alive.
I am the woman. I had almost given up hope of ever becoming well. It had been 12 years. 12 years of pain, 12 years of suffering. Even worse, 12 years of social ostracism and being unable to take part in the life of my community and synagogue. The way I was bleeding made me ceremonially unclean, and I had to be careful not to make others unclean as well. I tried to get help from doctors. In fact, I spent all of my savings trying to get better. Instead, I became worse. I was almost ready to despair. Then one day, I heard about Jesus. Did you hear what he did for a leper? Jesus touched the man and he was healed. And he healed another man though it was Sabbath. I kept hearing about the miracles that Jesus had done. I thought, if he could touch a leper and heal someone on the Sabbath, then maybe he would be willing to heal someone like me. So when I heard that Jesus had come back to our town, I went out to see him. There were many people there. I tried to get near to Jesus, but at first the crowds were too thick. Then I saw one of the synagogue leaders and heard him ask Jesus to come and heal the leader's daughter. I didn't want to stop Jesus from going to help, but I did wonder what to do. Jesus wouldn't want to stop and help me now, but I couldn't give up. I knew how much I needed healing, and I knew Jesus had the power to help me. I thought, if I could just touch his clothes, I would be healed. Then I wouldn't have to interrupt, and it wouldn't be such a problem that I'm unclean. So I came as close as I could to him. I reached out and touched the hem of his cloak. At that moment, I knew Jesus had healed me. I felt the bleeding stop. Somehow, I also knew that when I touched Jesus, I didn't make him unclean. Instead, he made me clean, inside and out. I felt like shouting with joy, but I couldn't, or everyone would know what I'd done. I was about to slip away quietly when Jesus stopped, turned, and started looking around the crowd. "Who touched me?" he asked. "Who touched my clothes?" The men around him did not understand, but Jesus caught my eyes in the crowd. He knew. We stood looking at one another in the middle of the crowd, and I knew he wanted me to come forward. So trembling, I stumbled forward and fell at his feet. I told him everything, my sickness and uncleanness, my fear, my hope. I told him how I had touched him, and as I spoke, the crowd looked on and murmured. But Jesus smiled at me and raised me to his feet. Then he said something strange. "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. My faith has healed me. He and I both knew that it was his power, but I suppose it did take faith. Faith not to give up when the doctors said it was hopeless. Faith not to despair when I kept getting worse. Faith to believe that Jesus could heal me. Faith to reach out and touch him. God's power and my faith in his power.
I am Jairus. I am a ruler in our town synagogue. I am also the father of a girl I love dearly. Not long ago, I thought I had lost my daughter. She was 12 years old when she suddenly became very sick. We prayed and waited and did what we could, but she kept getting worse. As she became weaker and weaker and neared the point of death, I heard noises outside, and someone told me that a crowd was going to the lakeshore to meet Jesus. I'd heard about this Jesus. People said that he was a rabbi from Nazareth. They said he was a wonder worker, and that when Jesus laid his hands on someone, they would be healed. Could it be true? Was it possible? It was worth the chance. After all, my daughter was dying, and Jesus certainly wouldn't make her any worse. So I said goodbye to my little girl and went out, following the crowd on the way to find Jesus. When we reached him, the crowd recognized me and fell back a little. So I was able to get close enough to make my request. My little daughter is dying. Please, come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live. I saw compassion in Jesus' eyes, and he agreed to come. As we began to walk, however, the crowd pressed in again, and we could only move very slowly. I was anxious. What if we didn't make it in time? What would happen to my daughter? I knew she was so close to death. Just when I thought we couldn't possibly go any slower, Jesus stopped altogether and turned around. "Who touched my clothes?" he asked. He had to be joking. One of his disciples said what I was thinking. "You see the people crowding about you. How can you ask who touched you?" We were wasting time, but Jesus was looking at a poor woman in the crowd. She admitted to touching him and started to pour out excuses. I became angry. What right did she have to stop us? My daughter was in danger, and this unimportant woman was slowing us down. Couldn't she have waited? While this was going on, someone from my house came, and when I saw his face, I knew something was dreadfully wrong. "Jairus, I'm sorry. Your daughter is dead." It's too late. Why bother Jesus anymore? Oh, my little girl. How could this happen? Why didn't Jesus come earlier and help her? Now it was too late. I started to turn and return home when I realized Jesus was still with me. Watching the grief on my face, "Jairus," he said, "don't be afraid. Just believe." Believe what? My daughter was dead. What kind of miracle was he going to do now? When we finally reached my home, the place was in an uproar. The mourners had arrived, and there were people wailing everywhere. I went in to comfort my wife, and Jesus sent everyone away. Jesus took us into where my daughter's body was. He put his hand on my shoulder again, as if to say, "Watch and believe." Then he walked over to the bed and took my daughter's hand. "Little girl, get up." And she did. I could hardly believe my eyes. She was alive. She walked around and spoke to Jesus. Jesus even made sure that we fed her dinner. I turned back to look at Jesus. Who was this man who could even raise the dead? I thought then about the woman on the road and how Jesus had called her daughter and praised her faith. I'm a religious leader. I'm supposed to be faithful. But I know that my faith was weak that day. The woman on the road had more faith than I did. I gave in to despair when I heard of my daughter's death. I'm glad that my daughter's life did not depend on my faith. One thing is certain. From this day forward, I will believe.
Let's give them a hand, everyone. Today we're just going to spend a few minutes sitting with these characters, sitting with the woman, sitting with the little girl, and sitting with Jairus. Because I'm sure that you can identify with one of these characters. I don't know where you're at in life, but I'm sure that you can identify with some part of each of their stories. You might identify with this little girl who has felt wanted, treasured, and loved her whole life, but now finds herself terminally ill. She actually dies and is then left completely reliant on others. She has no power, she has no control. She actually is left with nothing. Her father, Jairus, has a religious background. This man is educated. He holds position and power, but he also cares deeply for his family. Or you might identify with this woman who has suffered for the last 12 years of her life. So much so that it has meant that she has been and continues to remain isolated, excluded, and unwanted by everyone. Jairus and this hemorrhaging woman couldn't be more different from one another. They come from incredibly different socio-economic and political locations. Jairus is from Jerusalem. He is educated, he is an aristocrat, flush with the currencies of power as head of the synagogue. He is wealthy, he is well connected, and he also seems to have this loving family. This guy seems to have it all. This woman, on the other hand, has suffered a debilitating illness for the last 12 years. She has actually been unwell for the same amount of time that this little girl has been alive. Her condition makes her unclean, and that means that she is always seen as sinful by others. And it keeps her excluded, isolated, and looked down on by everyone. This woman is in pain. She is weak. She has no money, because even if she had some to begin with, she'd have spent it long ago on going to doctors trying to find a cure. Her illness also means that even if she has a family, they wouldn't be able to eat food that she has cooked. They wouldn't be able to sit on chairs that she has sat on. They cannot even touch her without becoming unclean themselves. And she's not allowed to go to church, to her synagogue, to be seen around people there either. She is alone. She is unseen. So unseen, in fact, that we don't even know her name. She is completely and utterly desperate. But this guy Jairus and this woman have got one thing in common. They are not too proud to beg. Jairus knees in the dirt and empty-handed, pleads with Jesus to save his daughter. He chooses a father's love over a public figure's pride. And he begs for mercy. He recognizes and seeks an authority that is higher than his own. And this woman, well, she stomps all over the boundaries of social etiquette. Woman in these days should be accompanied at all times, but she is alone in the crowd. Woman should never approach a man without permission, but she grabs at his cloak. She approaches him without permission, and she grabs his cloak without consent. Women should declare their illness from a distance, but she hides her condition to get close enough to Jesus. She refuses to stay in her place. Both Jairus and this woman are willing to lose their religion to find family. Did you get that? Both Jairus and this woman are willing to lose their religion to find family. You see, Jairus was part of a religion that was trying to get rid of Jesus. Jesus threatened their power, and he threatened their control. And by Jairus going to Jesus, he was effectively saying that he disagreed with his church, that he disagreed with his leaders, that he disagreed with their tradition. And he was putting at risk his very relationship and position with them. And for this woman, her religion taught her that her blood left her unclean and that she was to be avoided at all costs. But she defies her religious purity codes to be healed, to be claimed as a daughter of God. And most of all, both of them refuse to believe that what is dead stays dead. She refused to believe that after 4,380 days of bleeding, she refused to believe that nothing would stop it. Instead, these guys desperately call out to Jesus. They call out to the one who defies the laws of nature, who leaves the grave empty, and who is never too late to offer new life. Their law, their tradition, their religious beliefs are actually reversed in this story. Rather than Jesus becoming unclean, rather than him becoming contaminated by these women, they are healed. They are restored, and they are purified by the power that lives in Jesus. That's who he is. He heals, he restores, he reconciles, and he saves. But he does so much more. You see, yes, he took their death away. He took the thing away that crippled them, that isolated them, that destroyed them. But it's not where the story ends. Now's where the much more comes in. Paul talks about the much more in Romans. In Romans chapter 5 and verses 9 to 11, he says this: "Since we have been made right in God's sight by the blood of Christ, or by the death of Jesus," he says he will certainly save us from God's judgment. For since our friendship with God was restored by the death of his Son, while we were still his enemies, we will certainly be saved through the life of his Son. So now we can rejoice in our wonderful new relationship with God because Jesus made us friends of God. We've got the death, and it is awesome, and it saves us. But the much more is that we have his life, his resurrected life living in us. The much more in this story is that Jesus refuses to allow this unseen woman to remain unseen. When she's at her most vulnerable, when she is exposed in the middle of a crowd that she shouldn't even be in, and Jesus calls her out, he does so not to shame her, but to include her. He calls her daughter. It actually brings a tear to my eye every time I read it, and I love how Jesus does this. He calls her daughter. He lets her know that she is a part of his family. Even when her religion, the ones who should love her, exclude her, Jesus reminds her that she is loved, that she is accepted by him, and that is what really matters. Ultimate inclusion. On Jesus' way to heal Jairus' dying daughter, Jesus stops and cares for another of his daughters, and he endorses her faith. He says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed." This woman touching Jesus should have made him unclean, but instead the touch made this woman clean. No longer defiled, no longer weak, no longer poor or an outcast, she is recognized and named as a faith-filled daughter of God. She is healed, and she walks away with peace. Jesus brings life to the dead. He brings restoration to the broken and healing to the sick. His ultimate plan for all of us is to reverse the law of sin and death. When Christians, when we say that Jesus was raised from the dead, we are saying that Jesus is still alive and at work in our world today. He is still out ahead of us. He's there with the poor and the outcasted and the rejected and the vulnerable. He's there with those of us who suffer. And don't think that I'm talking about other people today. I'm talking about us. Because we are poor and outcast and rejected and vulnerable. We all suffer. We are all broken in this world. And if we want to encounter the risen Jesus, if we want to understand him and his resurrection, then we need to go where he went. We need to do what he did. We need to serve like he served. We need to step into this world and see it like he sees it. It's the only way that we'll fully make sense of the resurrection, that we will fully come to believe it and understand it. Because we'll never fully come to know Jesus or his resurrection until we imitate his life in ministry. Our thinking around church, our thinking around this community has got to have the same level of compassion, love, responsibility, and accountability, not just in some poetic idea, but that we truly live with and for each other, even when we are people of great diversity.
I am the girl. I was dead in my sin. I am the girl. I was dead in my sin, literally. There was no hope. I needed a miracle. Then Jesus came and changed everything. He said, "Little girl, get up." Jesus saved me. He brought me back to life. Now I want to live for him.
I am the woman. I was broken and unclean. There was no hope for me until Jesus gave me hope. He healed me. He made me clean. Not only that, Jesus made me worthwhile. When I felt alone, he called me daughter, part of his family. I was an outcast and rejected, and he lifted me up and made me part of the community again. Jesus restored me to health and strength and hope and joy. Now, I want to follow him.
I am Jairus. That hit home for me this week. I have every advantage: a faithful background, religious training, and a position of leadership. I've seen God at work in my life and in the lives of others. I'm spiritually aware enough to recognize the coincidences in my life that are actually miracles. Despite these gifts God has given me, I sometimes still struggle to believe. Too often, I go to Jesus as a last resort because it can't hurt to try. Even after I ask for help, I still worry and get angry when things don't seem to go my way. When things look impossible, sometimes I despair.
No matter which of these people we identify with most today, it actually doesn't really matter. Because what we know is that Jesus met each of them right where they were. And he wants to do the same with us. If we've been raised to believe in God, if we've been given every advantage like Jairus, if we faithfully serve but sometimes doubt our place, sometimes we might doubt our gifting, maybe we struggle to believe from time to time, but God sees us and wants to make a difference in our life. If we sit here today and we are broken, if we are messed up, if we feel excluded, or if we feel totally desperate and alone, God sees us. And he not only sees us, but he calls us his children. He calls us son, and he calls us daughter. And he wants to reconcile our world and give us peace. He wants to restore us. Or if you sit here today and you just feel dead to the whole thing, if you feel unawake, as we like to call it round here, to God and what he thinks of us, maybe you doubt his very existence, he still sees us. And he just wants to wake us from our sleep, to restore all that is broken, so that we can live with the knowledge that we are loved, accepted, and included by him. Right where we are, church, is a safe place to be, because right where we are is where God is. Your name is Victory, God. And we come here today and we claim your power. And we praise you for what you've done for us. And God, we claim today that we will rise from the ashes of defeat, because you, our resurrecting King, choose to resurrect us. Every day, day after day, we get to choose again. We get to live again in your power. And so, God, we just thank you for that. We praise you for that. But we also ask for that again today. We just pray that we would live in victory as resurrected people in your power and in your name, Jesus. Amen.